Well, I'd like to tell you today about the aircraft portfolio and how it came to be as a result of combining, as Patricia said, several of my former careers. I grew up with an early interest in aviation. I probably would have been very happy here in Kansas. As a kid, I built models and drew airplanes, and kind of my thing in it as a kid was art and airplanes. And my first career was as an architect, and then I had a company where I was a graphic designer for a number of years, and I'll show you some of that work. But I think that this body of work is kind of a culmination of all the things that went before. Oops, two at a time there. Okay. I don't know how many of you have seen, there's a movie called Pushing Tin, and it stars John Cusack and Billy Bob Thornton, who are these very competitive and uptight air traffic controllers. And to blow off steam, they go out to the end of the runway and they wait for the planes to come right over them. And these big airliners have quite a bit of turbulence following them. And in the movie, the wind actually lifts them up off the ground and flips them over. And they just think that's the most fun that you can have. So anyway, as a kid, I kind of could relate to that because one of my favorite things was to go out to the runway at Los Angeles International Airport and stand right under where the planes were coming in. When I was in high school, a group of us drove down to LAX one night. I won't say whose idea this was, but we climbed over the fence and climbed up the high-intensity light towers just so we could get as close as we could to the flying over airplanes. I don't recommend that, though. So anyway, when I was about 14, I took my first flying lesson in a Luscombe, and when I turned 16, I started actually taking lessons. I would sweep out the hangar at the airport and return for an hour in a straight tail 150. And this was my instructor at the time, James Lister. He had been a Navy carrier pilot and a crop duster. And, well, he did some things with the plane that you wouldn't think you could do with a 150. When I graduated junior high school, my dad gave me a Keystone 8mm movie camera. And I immediately went out to Santa Monica Airport and took pictures of what else? Planes from underneath as they were landing. And I guess that was kind of like the first of what would become this portfolio. I went to school at Berkeley studying architecture in the 60s. It was an exciting time politically and artistically. And I studied also some painting and drawing and printmaking. After graduation, I moved to New York, where I got involved in, well, I worked and got my architect license in a regular day job. But at night I started designing these kind of alternative shelters. And these are some examples of those houses. They're little tiny. This is a little tiny bolt-together stress skin panelized house that I designed and built in 1972 in conjunction with a home magazine. And the whole thing would unbolt and fit into the back of a U-Haul truck. I built it in a barn in Connecticut and unbolted it and trucked it over to Woodstock, where I now live. And it mounted on 4 concrete piers. Interestingly enough, yesterday in the New York Times Magazine, they have a home section, and the lead article was about how people are, there's a whole movement going back to little tiny houses that there's a group of people that feel that their mortgages were too high and the heating bills were too high, and they've decided they're going to live in tiny houses. So if you go online, it's kind of an interesting article. This was another one of the little shelters I did. This one I did originally as a Popular Science article, Popular Science magazine, in about 1974. And it had a boat winch that raised and lowered a plywood floor and a tent that snapped on, kind of like a convertible top of an old-fashioned car. And this would fit into the back of in fact, there it is. I don't know if you can see, it's all in the back of a pickup truck, a little a Nissan pickup truck. And so then in 1975, I co-authored a book, Designing Houses, which is a guide to designing your own house. And I think you can still get it on Amazon. And then a few years after that, as a result of a magazine project that I had done, where they'd asked me to do some crafts projects, and I built a corrugated cardboard dollhouse, I ended up doing some plan books, including this one with plans for building classic American house styles out of recycled corrugated cardboard. And this book made it quite quickly to the remainder table, but I was able to, there we go, oops, oh, that's right, I was warned about this computer. It stops and then it goes too fast. Okay, so there we go. So anyway, I took the designs and I turned them into a set of 6 die-cut note cards, each in a classic American house style, like Greek Revival, Georgian, Victorian, and so forth. And I published them myself in 1983 as a little sideline. I had just gotten an Apple computer, the first 64K super-fast Apple computer, and I thought, I could put a business on it and start this little company. So the whole thing started in a room about 15 square feet with these 6 cards. And around that time, I had become aware of the photography of a German husband and wife team, Bern and Hilla Bescher, and I loved their work. I'd always liked indigenous and industrial architecture, and here some of the best of it was collected in a concise and graphically beautiful way. I liked the direct architectural compositions, and they shot with a large format camera which captured a lot of detail. And I don't know that I can say that I consciously was influenced by this in my work, but I think as I was putting this talk together and I started pulling things together, I thought, wow, this must have influenced what I was doing. And beginning in the 50s and continuing for several decades, the Beschers photographed aging industrial structures in Europe and the United States. And they created a vast typology that included mine structures, water towers, houses, and factories. And the way they photographed them was always in the same straight-on, deadpan way, and always on an overcast day, which is good for photography because when you photograph in sunlight, the sun is so strong on the highlighted areas and the shadows are so dark that you can't get both of them. You can either get the shadows or the highlight, but you really can't, the film or digital can't capture both at the same time. Now, when you look with your eye from one to the other, your pupil automatically opens and closes. You're not aware of it, but that's why you're able to look from a shadow to a highlight. So by photographing on a neutral day, you can get that kind of detail, which is what they did, and the skies became kind of abstract and neutral. By organizing the images in a strict rectangular grid, they became a kind of visual symphony in one key, but with numerous modulations. where the eye can linger comparing and contrasting the differences and the similarities. And I personally like these 19th century coal mine winding towers. They remind me of the erector sets that I used to build with when I was a kid. In addition to their personal photography, the Beschers taught at the Dusseldorf Art Academy, where they influenced a number of students with their documentary style, and among the people who went on to make names for themselves were Andreas Gursky, Thomas Ruff, and Candida Hoffer. Before the Beschers, August Sander, the great German photographer who had influenced them, in the 1920s created a monumental collective portrait of German society. He photographed individuals in exactly the same way, straight on, almost always in three-quarter length standing views. And he categorized them by profession or social class, and sometimes with the tools or the trades or the style of clothing that they would wear. And my editor, Bob Morton, points out that today such a thing would be difficult to do. Now, maybe I was influenced by the German photographic typologies, but in the 80s, I had begun photographing a wide variety of subjects for note cards using a consistent, very formal direct view, silhouetted against a plain white background. Subjects included nature, cars, planes, trains, buildings. These were all die-cut cards, and you may have seen them in stores as they were sold all over the world, actually. And this was from a spread in Graphis Design Annual, which published them. And those 6 original cards eventually led to a design and publishing venture that would grow over 17 years. And these are some of the images. I guess you could say that they kind of formed, a lot of them formed a kind of note card typology. During that period, I also did some graphic work for museums like MoMA and the Museum of Natural History. This is some wrapping paper and a Christmas card that I designed for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I did a panorama card for the Museum of Natural History that folded into a curve, and I took their panoramas, you know, that floor that has those great panoramas, and I made these cards with these curved panoramas for them. I did some mummy cards for the Brooklyn Museum. They're big on Egyptian there. But in 2000, I found it was just harder and harder to find time to be creative. The company actually grew. I had 20 employees, and I found that I was being more a businessman than a creative person. So in 2000, at the peak of merger mania, I was so lucky I sold the company. And 6 months later, I could never have sold it. But I set up a state-of-the-art digital studio in Kingston, New York, and I started spending my time on fine art photography, which is what I really wanted to do. So I traveled around. I went to Cuba, and I put together a portfolio of Cuban photography, and I was offered a show with that in Portland, Oregon, and that was my first show at a photography gallery. And these are some of the pictures from the Cuban portfolio. And the work emphasized architectural, documentary, and environmental portraits. But again, even with this work, I always like my lines, you know, very straight and square. My photographs are always flat to the walls. I just have this kind of, or symmetrical if they're not flat to the walls. This is looking out to the Malecon in the old section of Havana. But I kept thinking in my mind, I would have these visions of those airplanes approaching at the end of the runway. And I wondered if I could translate it into photographs, you know. So there's just something amazing, you know, about a 747 that's just coming at you, and then it gets right over you, and it's like it blocks out all the light, and then it just whizzes over, and you just go, wow, what was that, you know? So I decided I would try to see if I could capture the feeling and that beauty of these incredible machines as they come over. So I started looking around LAX, trying to find places where I could photograph, and figuring out what I was going to photograph with. So I started off with, I needed a camera that would be hand-holdable because you can't use a tripod. These things are just moving too fast. And I wanted something bigger than 35 millimeter because I wanted to blow them up as big as I could. And so I settled on a 2¼ film camera in around 2000. But shortly after that, Kodak brought out the first 16 megapixel digital back for a 645 camera, the Contax and a few others. And in those days, 16 megapixels was huge. And so I immediately bought one, and it was great because now I could shoot, and I could practice on every plane, and if the picture wasn't good, I'd throw it away. And they're very hard actually to get really sharp ones, and you have to pan exactly with the plane, and it has to be right, you know, in the viewfinder, and the pilot has to be lined up with the runway, and getting all that together, and there has to be a time when they're not adjusting for wind, and if you watch them, you know, they're always doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and if they do that and they're right over me, then the wheels don't center, and I don't like it. It's not what I'm trying to do. So trying to organize everything, be just right. So anyway, you know, so it evolved into a series of front views and underneath views. And just about as I was getting going, there was the 9/11 attacks, and I myself, and I figured nobody else really wanted to look at an airliner coming at you at that point. So I kind of put it away for about a year, and then I began photographing again. So I went out to the runway and I started taking pictures, and I found that at first I left the sky in, but I usually tried to photograph it when it was overcast or a day like this. This is actually with an overcast sky, and I realized that was the look that I wanted if I was going to create this typological portfolio. So I started to use Photoshop because I couldn't get out there every day and have perfect weather. And so Photoshop allowed me to take out the backgrounds and also to work with the image, because I'm shooting the bottom of the airplane. It's in shadow. And so when I get that first picture, it's usually pretty dark. And if I shoot for the shadow, then the edges of the plane are burnt out. So I have to kind of work with it, and I've developed some techniques over the years. In April of 2004, I showed the work at a photography festival they hold in Houston called PhotoFest. And there was an editor for Germany's photography magazine called Photo Magazine, and he reviewed the work, and 2 months later it was on the cover with a 6-page portfolio inside. That was the first publication I had. And then more recently, Die Zeit magazine, Germany's news magazine, ran a cover with one of the images. And I was talking to a photographer friend of mine, Angelika Reinhofer, who studied photography in Germany, and she's from Germany. And I was saying, wow, the Germans really like the work. They, 2 of the magazine covers I've had have both been in Germany. And she said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. She said that in the late 18th century, the Germans had a strong interest in science and collecting. And they collected things like rocks and flowers and butterflies and preserved and mounted them and drew them all in the same mugshot fashion. And she mentioned Alexander von Humboldt, who was probably one of the first people to do this. He was a German naturalist and explorer in the late 1700s. And he wrote about the importance of collecting specimens and looking at detail. And he believed that a scientist could perceive unity in variation and draw scientific conclusions from a close observation of looking at similar objects. And Darwin, of course, did the same thing in England, making his observations from thousands of examples of shells and rocks and birds, and that led him to his conclusions about the origin of species. And I think in some way my work shares in this tradition. Only my flying creatures can't be caught in a net, and they're difficult to pin in an album. They're a little more hard to photograph, and also I think it's interesting to note that this body of work would have been extremely difficult to produce even 20 years ago with the technology. So I kind of established a set of rules for myself that the images would be shot in the same way, all perfectly centered, highly detailed, without blur, and exactly overhead. Using this, I continued to build a typological portfolio, I guess you would call it. Patricia McDonald defines typologizing as creating a virtual registry of variation upon a theme to better grasp a clearly defined cultural phenomenon. Now, it's not difficult to photograph aircraft passing over, but it's difficult to get them perfectly centered and with no blur. As I mentioned, the timing and panning and lens selection are important. As a plane is approaching, I'm always trying to figure out what is it, And some of them are real obvious, but then you get a 777 and they've got, like 3 different lengths. And same with Airbus A340. There's the 200, the 300, the 600, and they take a different lens. So to do it right, anyway. So I'm always trying to figure out what I'm going to need. And for one shot in particular, I had a helicopter, you'll see it later, that was going to hover for me. It was a very large helicopter, and I had to tell him what altitude, so I had to get out my old trigonometry book and figure out what would fill the viewfinder at the right height and so forth. The other thing that I mentioned before, it's really unpredictable, is the pilots lining up with the runway. And after years of doing this, I can tell you that some airlines are better than others. And there's one in particular, one airline that I have still not gotten a picture of them, and I won't mention their name, but except to say it's a low-cost airline that's sort of a subsidiary of one of the others. I usually go out to the airport and I bring a folding chair and I just sit there, and the police have gotten to know me, so they don't bother me anymore. And I bring articles. The LA Times had written an article about what I was doing when I had a show out there, so I bring that and I show it to them. But usually I spend 4 or 5 hours at a time trying to get some good shots. A review in the Smithsonian Air and Space magazine gave me a nice compliment. They quoted their own photographer, Chad Slattery. He said, "The photos look simple but are very difficult technically. The airliners scream over at 140 to 150 knots, actually sometimes faster. They're in his viewfinder a split second, yet he gets them in focus and perfectly symmetrical." Not always, but after a while you get enough of them. And in addition to doing the front views, I did a series of side views. Now these are all in the air, and you can tell that because the landing gear of the ones that have at least two wheels on a main, they're all tilting in one direction, forward or backward, depending on the plane, and that's because the rear wheel will hit first and then the front wheel. So these are all flying. And these are some of the more interesting paint schemes. I put this one together. I'm pretty sure that several of these have been painted over. They're not around anymore. The one on the lower right-hand corner was Air Nippon, and it was painted up with Pokemon figures when Pokemon was popular in those days. So, as Patricia mentioned, I started showing the work with galleries in the mid-2000s. And in May of 2007, Abrams published my book, Aircraft the Jet as Art, which has sold out of its first printing. And I think they did a small second printing, which is down to just, I think, a few hundred left. And there's an Italian edition also by Mondadori. Over the years, as the camera technology improved, I would trade up, and now I'm shooting with a 39 megapixel back, because I want to make the images as big as I can. My goal is to make them as big as the actual airplane. So, the one in the show, I think, I think it's about 70 by 70 inches. When you walk in, it's this airliner. It's a Boeing 767, an American Boeing 767. And this is a front view of a China airline 747-400, and this is in the show at 45 by 90 inches. And it was shot with a Zeiss, Carl Zeiss 350 millimeter f4 with the 39 megapixel. And if you look close, you can see the pilots in the cockpit, and you can see them with the light shining off their sunglasses. So when you look at that, look for that. I continued to build a portfolio, and I became familiar with many of the different models of the jetliners and the varied paint schemes that the airlines use, and when they might arrive, although that changes, and often they'll switch a runway at the last minute. I think I've got some great plane I've been waiting a year for, and at the last minute they'll switch to the parallel runway. They land on the outside runways and they take off on the inside runways, but if they're not busy, they'll sometimes say, okay, you can land on the inside runway, and they'll actually switch on approach and go over it. So, darn, it's like. So this one is Maryland. Southwest has a series of planes they've painted up for the states they fly to. There's just only one of each, and this one I've seen a couple times. And this one they painted up as an orca whale. And for SeaWorld, there's 3 of these, and I've seen this one a few times. And then somebody had emailed me and told me there was a plane painted like a salmon, and I should look for it. And it took me a while to find it, but it's an Alaska plane, and it's painted as a salmon. They got a grant from the Alaska Fisheries Association to paint it. I think it was $400,000 to paint it. And then that became kind of a political controversy because people thought the money could have been spent better other ways. And there's this whole thing. If you go online, you'll see blogs about it. It took me a while to get this. I've seen it 3 times, and each time I got a better shot. And the last time I got a really good shot of it. Another one of my favorites that are painted is this Alaska one that's got the Walt Disney characters wrapped around it. It's got Minnie and Mickey and Donald. From the side, it's a big billboard for Disney and Southwest, but from underneath, it's got this wonderful distorted mirror image of Mickey, Minnie, and Donald. And I'm glad that the designers didn't think anyone would be looking at it from the bottom, so there's no advertisements. It's just this kind of goofy plane. My show here has, I think, 34 pictures. Is that right, Patricia? And everything from a Cessna 172 to the Boeing 747. If I had to pick a favorite plane, it would be the 747 for me. It's kind of the Empire State Building of planes. You can identify it by its distinctive second story in the front. The significance of this plane would be hard to overstate. It's a 4-engine jet. It was the first wide-body airliner produced, certified in 1969. They can weigh 875,000 pounds on takeoff, and they're 232 feet long, 6 stories high, and can hold over 500 passengers. They have 6 million parts, 171 miles of wiring, and they've logged over 35 billion miles. The Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk could have been performed in the 150-foot economy section. When Boeing, this plane kind of came out of a military plane that Boeing had bid on and lost, and they had developed these huge engines for the military plane. And when they lost the contract, they said, well, you know, we've got these engines, and you know, let's do something with them. So they kind of bet the farm on this. If this had failed, they probably would have gone bankrupt. But it turned out to be way more successful than anybody ever thought it would be. They thought it would be good for, you know, so many years, and then the supersonic planes were going to take over, but that never happened. I think over 1,400 have been built, and there's a new version is scheduled for '09. And until recently, it held the passenger capacity record for 37 years until the Jagunda Airbus 380, which is now will hold the record. So it's kind of like the Empire State Building in that way. Walter Boyne, who wrote the foreword for my book, he talks about how the wing changes shape to get into the landing configuration, like a giant bird spreading its feathers to slow down. These enormous flaps on giant jack screws come down along with the 18 wheels that support the weight of the plane. If you look at the bottom of this airplane, it's quite different. This is an antique DC-8. It's the first of the commercial jets that were built in the 50s. And there's no front wing slats. The flaps are modest, you know, single-stage flaps. And this is used as a cargo plane now by DHL. I think this one's in the show, if I'm not mistaken. This is the Airbus, the 4-engine Airbus A340 series that competes with the Boeing 747 on long hauls. This is a Virgin Atlantic A340-600. And these pilots are usually lined up with the center line really well. I don't know, maybe it's Branson, I don't know. And this is the Boeing 777, which is the current state-of-the-art for Boeing. It's a really beautiful plane and has a 99% record of what do they call it, where they leave the gate. You get to fly on it. You can, if you're at the airport and you want to know if the plane you're looking at is a 777 instead of a 767, it has 6 wheels on each main instead of 4, which the 767 and the 757s have. So if you see 6 wheels, it's a 777. And I read on the Boeing website that a lightly loaded 777 can go 0 to 60 in less than 6 seconds. I think these are the most powerful engines on any, well, I don't know about the A380 now, but for Boeing these are. And then this one, when you come into the show, this is the 767 I mentioned. And that's kind of the most common plane flying the Atlantic. A little fact on the Boeing website, a 767-400 extended range uses about 60 gallons of fuel per passenger flying from New York to London, which is about half of what an economy car would use if you could drive that route. The twin-engine Boeing 757-200 is the narrow body, kind of basic jetliner for, it is used to go across the country also, but mostly it's used domestically, and was designed along with the 767. The most popular of the small airplanes is the Boeing 737, and I think Boeing has had orders for over 6,000 of these, the most for any jetliner. And there's so many of these Southwest ones that I just use them for target practice, kind of. The Airbus this is an Airbus A319. They have an A319, A320 series, which is the equivalent of the 737 series in terms of size and range. I think JetBlue uses A319s and 20s. And if you fly American, you've probably flown one of these MD-80s. They're no longer in production. They're not as fuel efficient as the newer planes, but it's two engines mounted on the rear, and it's kind of long. Fuselage gives it a distinctive rocket ship look. And also in the smaller categories is the Bombardier series. They're the third largest manufacturer of jets, and they do a lot of these regional jets, the CRJ series. I flew over here on a CRJ 200, and the thing I really like about it is that they have adjustable reading lights. I wish all the airliners had those. But that's a nice thing Bombardier does. It's kind of, like the coffee cup in the holder in the car. Last year, Bombardier actually contacted me, and they asked if I would go down to the National Business Aircraft Association in Atlanta, where they were unveiling their newest glass cockpit Global Express XRS business jet. And they got the idea that they wanted to have me do a book signing, but they wanted their jet on the cover. So we started talking about having them bring their XRS and what airport could they make a low pass. And the time was kind of running out because they had to get it printed and everything. So one day I just did a quick look in my library, and I don't have a lot of business jets that I haven't used in the book or somewhere. Actually, business jets are much harder to get than airliners because they're going about the same speed, but they're smaller, so you have to use a longer lens. And I don't know if you know in photography, the longer the lens, the more likely you're going to have blur. So I found I actually had one of their Global Express XRSs. Oops, one too many. Oh, you know what? This doesn't have it in it. Okay. Well, anyway. I had a picture of it, but they did print it. They put it on the cover of their book, and I went down there and did a signing for them. So anyway, this is a Cessna Citation X, which I believe is the fastest of the business jets, and it's certainly one of the most beautiful, and I believe it's made right here in Wichita. And this is a Beechcraft Hawker 850 XP, and I'm partial to Beechcraft because I own a Bonanza. Oh, that's the picture that I meant to show you before. Okay, so it was out of place. So this is the cover that they did for the book. And anyway, this is the Hawker Beechcraft. Let's see. Oh, okay. How are we doing on time? Okay. So I've also been doing some helicopters recently. This is a LA County Fire Department Bell first responder. And quick story, while I was photographing in Van Nuys, there was a woman who had finished a flight, and she was pushing her Cessna back, and I helped her push it into place. And we got to talking, and I told her I was trying to get helicopter pictures, and it turns out she was a very respected ex-Army Black Hawk pilot who flew all over LA for all kind, like the news services, and everybody knew her. And so she called the head of fire operations, and they opened up the door, and I came over, and I got this shot, and I sent him a picture, a nice print of it, and we kind of became friends, and he invited me to come back and fly with them, and I spent a day flying in their first responder Black Hawk, and that was amazing. That's another story. Then they also, he made it possible for me to get their monster helitanker, which is, this one's in the show, it's a Sikorsky S-64. The county keeps it sitting on the ground waiting for any possible fire. It costs $6,000 an hour to fly it, and they were nice enough to arrange a training flight so I could get the picture. And somebody had to actually help me from falling over while I was shooting underneath. The prop wash is so strong on this thing. And lastly, I've been working on some things. These aren't in the show. They're all kind of brand new. There's an air show in Oshkosh called the EAA Airshow, and I just came back from that, my second time there, and I really wanted this shot. It's a B-17, and I got one at the show, so I was really, really happy. And this is a front view of it, and it's flying here. It's not on the ground. This one is a Ford trimotor. If you go to the Smithsonian Air and Space, when you go into the main space, there's one hanging right in there. It's kind of like a giant corrugated metal tin can that flies. It's got 3 engines, was produced by Ford in 1925, and it's just got this wonderful kind of look to it. It's like, such an antique. And then quickly I'll do a couple others. Harrier jet, and this is the vertical takeoff and landing Harrier, and that shot's from the EAA. And this is the Lockheed Martin Raptor F-22. This is the current state-of-the-art jet fighter. There's nothing in the world that can match it. And it's really amazing what they demonstrated it doing. I'll tell you a little secret. This is made up from 2 pictures. It was flying so fast I couldn't get the whole thing in one shot in the viewfinder, but I was going bang, 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 and I was able to take 2 pictures and put it together. But I'm not going to tell anybody else. So. And lastly, this was probably one of the most fun things to photograph. The blimp people were nice enough to let me photograph while they were practicing landings and takeoffs out at their base near LA. And so I got this then. So, well, and just to summarize in conclusion, while there are a lot of similarities between my work and the work of the German photographers from the Dusseldorf School, there's also differences. I have collected and studied a series of objects that are relatively similar, but infinitely different in their details. And I have perhaps pictured these objects with a high degree of precision, which may have to do with my training as an architect. And I do have a kind of objective view, which probably reflects my fascination with wanting to see how things are made. And I think my graphic design background has to do with how I've structured these and organized them. But as an artist, I'm really more interested in creating a compelling artistic vision for people to enjoy more than I am in creating a documentary, though I do appreciate and I like that it is a documentary, and I'm glad that it'll be there, because I think some of these planes won't be in a while. And also I'm a little different in that I'm not averse to altering reality as I do when I remove the backgrounds and I enhance the images where I feel it helps in the computer. Well, is that postmodern or deconstructivist? I'm going to leave that to the historians and scholars. For me, it's enough to know that I've enjoyed myself in creating this work, and that if in my gallery shows and sales of prints and in the copies of my book that have been collected, people are now also enjoying my creations, then I'm satisfied. It's been a pleasure sharing my work with you, and next time you're at an airport and you look out the window and see a Boeing 747, take a minute to ponder what an incredible invention it is. Thank you.